Most fathers dream about making their kids smile on Christmas morning. Kody Brown had a different plan. He spent thousands of dollars on shiny custom mini bikes for his favorite wife's children and handed his own biological daughter a cheap clearance bin sweater and a book nobody picked out with care. He stood in that driveway expecting tears, begging, or at the very least, a reaction he could use against her. He got nothing. No tears, no begging, no fight, just an 11-year-old girl standing completely still, staring at her father with the kind of silence that is louder than any argument. A look that said one thing clearly: I already know what I mean to you, and I have stopped caring. In that single moment, a child did what years of arguments, divorces, and public drama could not. She completely destroyed Kody Brown's ego, not with anger, not with words, but with total, unshakable indifference. And once a father loses his daughter's respect that completely, no amount of money, no camera crew, and no grand gesture can ever bring it back. This is the story of how truly Brown became the most powerful person in the room, by simply choosing to feel nothing at all. Kody Brown orchestrated a Christmas morning scene that was explicitly designed to crown him the ultimate hero on TLC. This was not a spontaneous family gathering filled with warmth and genuine connection. It was a calculated, televised performance where every single detail had been arranged in advance to serve one person's ego. There is a specific kind of arrogance that happens when a man truly believes his wallet dictates his worth as a father, and Kody Brown embodied that arrogance completely on that morning. He thought throwing massive amounts of money at a situation would mask the glaring emotional absence he had subjected his family to for months. This was supposed to be his triumphant moment, a televised victory lap where he showered his chosen household with luxury while expecting the rest of his family to simply be grateful for the scrap. The geography of the gift exchange told the entire story before a single word was spoken. On one side of the room, Robin's children were given thousands of dollars worth of high-powered, expensive mini bikes. The extravagance was loud, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. On the other side of the room was Truly, a daughter Kody had barely seen in months, handed a cheap discount sweater and an afterthought book. The visual contrast was sickening. Two groups of children sat in the same room, and every person present, including the camera crew, could immediately see that they were not being treated as equals. One group had been given a celebration, the other had been handed an afterthought wrapped in discount paper. Insider reports have recently surfaced suggesting that this disparity was not an accident. Exclusive theories circulating online claim that Robin actually picked out Truly's gifts at the very last minute from a clearance bin, while Kody spent weeks obsessing over the custom details of the bikes for her children. The time investment alone speaks volumes. A man who allegedly spent weeks coordinating the specifications of expensive mini bikes for his favorite household could not find the time or the thoughtfulness to select a meaningful gift for his own biological daughter. The difference between the two sides of that room was not a matter of budget constraints or oversight. It was a matter of priority, and Truly was not one. Rumors suggest Kody even specifically directed the camera crew on where to stand so they could capture his grand reveal of the bike, completely ignoring where Truly was seated. He was not simply celebrating his stepchildren. He was staging a production. The cameras were positioned to document his generosity, to frame him as the ultimate provider, and to capture the reactions of the children receiving the most expensive gifts. The framing was intentional. The storytelling was deliberate, and Truly was written into the scene as a background character in her own family's Christmas. Kody assumed he had trapped Truly emotionally on national television. The logic of the trap was calculated and cold. This was a classic psychological double-bind, designed to put a child in an impossible situation with no clean exit. If she opened the cheap sweater, looked across the room at the shiny new motorcycles, and started to cry, Kody would have the ultimate ammunition. He could point at her reaction, shake his head, and call her ungrateful in front of millions of viewers. He could spin the narrative to claim that Christine was raising a spoiled child who could not appreciate a simple, thoughtful gift. The attack would not just be on Truly. It would be a direct strike at Christine's credibility as a mother. On the other hand, if Truly begged for a turn on the bikes or pleaded openly for his attention and affection, his ego would be stroked. He wanted her to fight for his scrap. He needed her to feel small so he could feel big. He needed visible desperation from a child to confirm his own sense of power within the family structure. For years, Kody had relied on creating jealousy among his wives and children to feel dominant. He used his time, his money, and his affection as weapons to keep everyone desperate for his approval. Reports claim Kody was bragging to production assistants earlier that week, boasting about what a generous provider he was going to appear to be on camera. He was fully expecting Truly to play directly into his hand. He had constructed what he believed was a foolproof scenario, a public stage, a captive audience, and a child he assumed he could manipulate into confirming his self-image. He had planned for tears. He had planned for begging. He had planned for gratitude. What Kody Brown had not planned for was silent. When the wrapping paper was torn off and the reality of the situation set in, Truly didn't cry. She didn't throw a fit. She didn't beg for a ride on the mini bike. Instead, as Kody ran around the driveway beaming like a toddler, loudly showing off the expensive toys to Robin's kids and soaking up the manufactured glory, Truly stood in the background with absolute chilling stillness. She delivered a deadpan, silent stare of utter indifference that cut right through the noise. She accepted the cheap gift with a look that communicated something devastating. It was a look that said, "I know exactly what my value is to you, and I no longer care." In that single moment, an 11-year-old girl communicated more emotional truth than an entire season of carefully edited television ever could. Reports from people close to the family claim that in that exact moment, the atmosphere in the room completely shifted. The energy that Kody had been frantically manufacturing, the forced laughter, the exaggerated excitement, the performative generosity, hit a wall of complete silence and simply died. The camera operators reportedly felt a wave of secondhand embarrassment so strong that they had to actively try not to zoom in on Truly's heartbreakingly stoic face. The professionals behind those cameras had filmed years of Brown family drama, arguments, tears, and tension. But something about the quiet, knowing stillness of a child who had simply stopped expecting anything from her father was different. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was the kind of pain that does not perform for an audience, and that made it far more devastating than any screaming match ever filmed on that show. To understand why Truly's silence was so psychologically destructive to Kody, it is important to understand how his entire system of control operates. For years, Kody Brown had relied on creating jealousy among his wives and children to feel powerful. He used his time, his money, and his affection as weapons to keep everyone competing desperately for his approval. It was a continuous game of emotional musical chairs, and he was the one controlling the music. Every dynamic in the Brown household was built on the premise that his attention was worth fighting for. When people fought for it, he felt powerful. When they cried over the absence of it, he felt important. When they begged for more of it, he felt validated. Kody had no script for a child who simply looked at him and felt nothing at all. Kody had planned for 2 possible reactions and had a response ready for each one. Tears would have given him a narrative of ingratitude to weaponize. Begging would have fed his ego directly. What he had not accounted for, and what he had no defense against, was total emotional detachment. Exclusive theories from behavior analysts watching the raw footage suggest that Kody's frantic energy around the bikes was actually a panic response. He was escalating his own excitement because he was waiting for Truly's emotional reaction. And when she gave him nothing but a blank, knowing stare, he started spiraling. His internal system had encountered something it could not process, and the visible result was a grown man performing happiness with increasing desperation in front of a camera crew that could see exactly what was happening. His behavior became increasingly erratic as the minutes passed. He laughed too loudly. He performed an exaggerated, jovial energy that he clearly hoped would be contagious. He was practically vibrating with inauthenticity. He kept glancing off camera at Truly, trying to provoke even the smallest reaction, a flicker of jealousy, a moment of longing, anything that would confirm he still held emotional power over her. Every glance in her direction was met with the same unbothered stillness. The harder he tried, the more the gap between his performance and the reality of that driveway became visible to everyone present. He was putting on a show for an audience of one, and that one person had already left the building. The thematic hypocrisy of the moment was impossible to miss. Here was the patriarch who had spent a decade on national television preaching about the inherent fairness and spiritual beauty of plural marriage. Here was the man who had publicly claimed, season after season, that every wife and every child in his family held equal value. And here he was, caught on camera physically dividing his own children into royalty and peasants based entirely on which wife he currently chose to prioritize. The contradiction between the image Kody had spent years constructing and the reality captured in that driveway was laid completely bare in a single afternoon. Robyn was reportedly panicking backstage as well. Whispers from people close to the production claimed she was desperately overcompensating, telling Truly how beautiful the cheap sweater was, fully aware that the unfolding scene was painting both her and Kody as the clear villains of the season. No amount of forced enthusiasm over a clearance bin gift could close the distance between a custom mini bike and a discount sweater. The camera had already recorded everything. The damage was already done. And at the center of it all stood Truly Brown, still, composed, and completely unmoved, holding more power in her silence than Kody Brown had managed to manufacture with thousands of dollars and weeks of planning. Before the gifts were even handed out, a producer reportedly pulled Kody aside and warned him directly that the optics of the situation were badly skewed. The warning was clear and specific. The audience would instantly notice the enormous gap in the value of the gifts being distributed between the two sides of the family. This was not a vague creative suggestion from a junior crew member. This was an experienced television professional looking at the setup of that room and recognizing that what was about to be filmed would not play well to millions of viewers at home. The producer understood something that Kody either could not or refused to see, that a camera does not editorialize, it simply records. And what that camera was about to record was deeply unfair. Kody allegedly brushed the warning off entirely. He reportedly claimed that viewers would simply see a happy family having a good time. He genuinely believed his own constructed narrative so completely that a direct, professional warning failed to penetrate it. This was not the response of a man who made an oversight. This was the response of a man so convinced of his own performance that he could not conceive of the audience seeing through it. He had spent years curating a public image as a devoted, generous patriarch, and in that moment, he believed that image was strong enough to survive whatever the cameras captured. He was wrong. Inside the TLC editing room, a significant debate reportedly erupted over whether to air the footage at all. Network executives were said to be genuinely shocked by the visible cruelty of what had been recorded. Editors argued among themselves that airing the scene could irreparably damage Kody's public standing and potentially harm the show's long-term marketability. The concern was not trivial. Sister Wives had built its audience on the premise of a functional, if unconventional, family navigating plural marriage with love and mutual respect. What the cameras had captured in that driveway was something fundamentally different. It was not drama. It was not conflict. It was a man publicly demonstrating to his own biological daughter that she occupied a lower tier in his life than his favorite household, and doing so on Christmas morning. However, the showrunners ultimately decided to leave the scene in the final cut. The reasoning, according to insider reports, was straightforward. Truly's silent, deadpan stare was powerful television. Her composure in the face of such visible inequality was the kind of authentic, unscripted moment that reality television spends years trying to manufacture and rarely captures genuinely. The network recognized that audiences would not side with Kody. They would rally behind Truly. By keeping the footage in the final edit, TLC effectively threw Kody to the wolves and allowed the world to see exactly who he had become. He was a king standing in a driveway with no subjects left to rule. The network's decision to air the scene uncut was, in its own way, its own verdict on Kody Brown's behavior. When the episode aired, the public response confirmed every concern that producer had raised before the cameras even started rolling. Body language experts, psychologists, and fans tore the scene apart frame by frame across social media. The profound silence of an 11-year-old girl became the loudest, most discussed moment of the entire season. Kody was not celebrated as a generous provider. He was globally exposed as a man who had attempted to use financial inequality to manipulate a child on national television. The fallout extended far beyond the editing room and the viewing public. When the older Brown siblings learned about the staggering price difference between the custom mini bikes and Truly's clearance bin gift, reports claim that a sibling group chat exploded with immediate and intense anger. Several of the older children, who were already deeply estranged from Kody, reportedly viewed this moment as the definitive line in the sand. These were not young children processing a confusing situation. These were adults who had watched their father's behavior escalate over years, and what happened to Truly on that Christmas morning read to them not as poor judgment, but as deliberate cruelty. Reports claim that angry messages were exchanged rapidly, with some siblings threatening to drive directly to Robin's house and confront Kody face-to-face about his blatant financial favoritism toward one household over another. The situation was volatile enough that Christine reportedly stepped in and explicitly asked her older children to stand down. Her reasoning was protective and clear. She did not want Truly exposed to any further drama or conflict that could compound the pain the child had already experienced that morning. Christine's priority in that moment was her daughter's stability, not a confrontation that would generate more chaos. The older siblings reportedly held back, but the seeds of permanent estrangement had already been planted. The Christmas incident did not create the fractures in the Brown family, it simply made them irreparable. Robin's role in the disaster was also coming under intense scrutiny from multiple directions simultaneously. Viewers had long speculated about the degree to which Robin influenced Kody's financial and emotional decisions regarding his other children. The Christmas gift disparity brought those speculations into sharp focus. Reports claim that Robin intentionally selected the clearance bin sweater and the afterthought book for Truly, with full knowledge that Kody was spending thousands of dollars on custom gifts for her own children. Exclusive theories from long-term followers of the show argue that this was a calculated power play, a deliberate move designed to establish a visible hierarchy on camera and confirm to the viewing audience that Robin's household was the undisputed center of the Brown family universe. However, when Truly refused to break down in tears or react with visible distress, Robin's alleged plan backfired completely. The composed, unbothered silence of a child was a far more damaging image than tears would have been. Whispers from people close to the production claim that Robin immediately attempted to spin the narrative off camera, complaining to producers that Christine had been poisoning Truly against them. She allegedly tried to reframe Truly's mature, silent indifference as a bad attitude, a deliberate effort to make an 11-year-old child look like the villain of the day. But no amount of off-camera narrative management could change what the footage already showed. The camera had recorded the price tags, the placement of the gifts, and the face of a child who had simply stopped expecting her father to treat her fairly. That same evening, after the cameras had stopped rolling and the driveway had emptied, Kody Brown reportedly made a phone call to Christine that revealed exactly how little he understood about what had just happened. He was not calling to reflect, he was not calling to acknowledge the visible inequality of that morning or to express any concern about how Truly might be feeling. He was calling in a complete panic. And his panic was entirely self-centered. His grand televised moment had not gone according to plan, and in Kody's internal framework, the only possible explanation was that someone else was responsible. That someone, as far as he was concerned, was Christine. Kody allegedly blamed Christine directly for Truly's lack of enthusiasm during the gift exchange. He reportedly raised his voice, accused her of raising an ungrateful child, and made the extraordinary demand that Christine force Truly to call him and personally apologize for not being more appreciative of the cheap sweater and book he had handed her while her step-siblings rode expensive custom mini bikes in the same driveway. The demand was revealing in its logic. In Kody's mind, the problem was not the inequality of the gifts. The problem was Truly's refusal to perform gratitude for a gift that did not warrant it. He was not asking for genuine reconnection with his daughter. He was demanding a performance, the same performance she had declined to give him on camera that morning. Christine did not argue back, she did not raise her voice, she did not defend herself against his accusations or engage with the manufactured drama he was attempting to pull her into. She reportedly said that Truly is very perceptive, and then quietly hung up the phone. That single sentence, delivered calmly and without elaboration, was more devastating than any shouting match could have been. It did not attack Kody directly, it did not list his failures as a father or catalog the events of that morning. It simply confirmed, in 5 words, that Truly had seen exactly what was happening and that her reaction was not a behavioral problem to be corrected, it was an accurate and reasonable response to the truth of her situation. The effect of that call on Kody was reportedly significant. His ego, already fractured by Truly's silent stare in the driveway, was completely shattered by Christine's unbothered dismissal. He had expected conflict, he had expected tears or defensiveness or an argument he could use to further cement his narrative of victimhood. What he received instead was 5 words and a dial tone. Christine had responded to his manufactured crisis with the same quiet indifference that Truly had shown him that morning. The pattern was unmistakable. He was losing control of his family, his narrative, and his ability to provoke the emotional reactions he depended on to feel powerful. In the weeks that followed the disastrous Christmas exchange, Kody aggressively lobbied TLC producers to film a makeup scene. He reportedly pitched the idea of an extravagant, heavily documented shopping spree with Truly, a public display of generosity designed to counteract the damage of the bike scene and prove to viewers that he was, in fact, a loving and present father. The proposal reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what had gone wrong. Truly had not withdrawn from her father because he lacked the financial means to provide for her. She had withdrawn because she lacked a father who showed up emotionally, consistently, and without conditions. A shopping spree filmed for television was not a solution to that problem. It was simply a more expensive version of the same performance that had already failed. Producers reportedly shut the idea down without hesitation, warning Kody that a staged redemption arc would appear entirely performative to an audience that had already watched the original scene and drawn its own conclusions. Attempting to manufacture a heartwarming follow-up would not rehabilitate his image. It would confirm that his priority was still the camera and his own reputation rather than his daughter's well-being. The producers understood what Kody could not, that the audience's trust, once broken by footage as clear and damning as what had been captured in that driveway, could not be rebuilt with a shopping trip. But the real reason the shopping spree never happened was not the producers. Reports claim that when the idea was casually floated to Truly herself, she simply said she was too busy. 2 words. No drama, no tears, no confrontation, just a quiet, matter-of-fact decline from a child who had fully withdrawn her investment in the relationship. She had figured out his game, and she simply chose to stop playing. Kody had spent that entire Christmas morning engineering a scenario designed to prove he held power over his daughter's emotions. Within weeks, she had demonstrated that the power had shifted entirely. An 11-year-old girl now held every card in the dynamic, and she was choosing not to play any of them. The psychological impact of that rejection reportedly sent Kody into a prolonged and increasingly erratic spiral. He had experience handling conflict. He had years of practice navigating arguments, accusations, and emotional confrontations within his plural family structure. What he had no experience handling was a child who was not angry, not sad, and not seeking resolution. A child who had simply moved on. It's been said that Truly's indifference is a weapon that Kody has no defense against. He knows how to handle a screaming match, but he has no idea how to handle a child who simply looks at him and sees nothing at all. The silence in the driveway had not been a momentary reaction. It was the visible beginning of a permanent emotional withdrawal that no grand gesture, no camera crew, and no shopping spree could reverse. Kody had come into that Christmas morning believing he was the one running the game. He had set the trap, staged the scene, positioned the cameras, and prepared his narrative. By the time the evening of that same day was over, his daughter had declined to be trapped, his ex-wife had dismissed him in 5 words, his producers had rejected his recovery plan, and the audience was already forming the verdict that would follow him indefinitely. The redemption arc he so desperately wanted to film never came. Not because the opportunity didn't exist, but because the one person whose participation it required had already quietly and completely closed the door. Truly Brown relocated to Utah with Christine following the dissolution of her parents' relationship, and by all credible accounts, she was thriving. Her life in Utah was described by those close to the family as happy, stable, and completely free of the tension and emotional manipulation that had defined her experience within the Brown family structure in Flagstaff. The contrast between her new environment and the household dynamics she had left behind was stark and immediate. Christine had built a life centered on consistency, emotional availability, and genuine presence, everything that the Christmas morning driveway had confirmed Kody was unwilling or unable to provide. Truly was no longer living inside a system that measured her worth against a price tag. She was simply living, and the stability of that life spoke louder than anything Kody could manufacture on camera. Communication between Truly and her father had, by multiple reports, reduced to brief and entirely formal text exchanges. There were no warm phone calls, there were no spontaneous visits or meaningful attempts at rebuilding the relationship through consistent, quiet effort. What remained of their contact was functional at best and symbolic of a relationship that had been hollowed out entirely. Kody had spent years using his presence as a reward and his absence as a punishment within his plural family. He had operated on the assumption that his children would always remain emotionally available to him, regardless of how inconsistently he showed up for them. Truly's brief, formal texts were the lived consequence of that assumption finally catching up with him. In what many close to the family described as another desperate attempt to buy back her affection, Kody reportedly sent a large and expensive birthday gift to Utah. The gesture followed the same pattern as every previous attempt at reconnection. It was financial, it was grand, and it was delivered without the sustained emotional investment that might have made it meaningful. Reports claim the gift was never opened by Truly. It was left in its box, untouched, a symbolic confirmation that the window for grand gestures had permanently closed. The unopened box was not an act of rebellion or a dramatic statement. It was simply the natural result of a child who had recalibrated her expectations and no longer assigned value to gifts from a father whose presence had been so consistently absent. He could no longer manipulate her, he could no longer hurt her, and he could no longer buy her. While Truly was building a stable and grounded life in Utah, Kody was reportedly deteriorating in Flagstaff in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. Reports describe him spending hours every night scrolling through social media threads, obsessively reading comments and fan analyses of the bike scene and its aftermath. He became convinced, according to insider accounts, that there was a coordinated smear campaign being run against him by his former wives, a belief that allowed him to avoid confronting the simpler and more uncomfortable truth that the footage simply reflected his own choices and their consequences. He demanded a formal meeting with TLC network executives, insisting that the bike scene had been deliberately edited to portray him as a villain. The claim ignored the reality that no editorial manipulation was required. The cameras had recorded what happened, and what happened had spoken entirely for itself. His behavior within Robyn's household was also reportedly affected. The atmosphere in the home became increasingly tense as Kody ruminated endlessly on what he framed as the betrayal of his biological children. He reportedly began evaluating his relationships in explicitly transactional terms, describing his investments of time and money into his children's lives and measuring them against what he perceived as an inadequate return in the form of loyalty and public support. He allegedly hinted at cutting off any child who failed to defend him publicly on social media, a threat that illustrated precisely how far his understanding of fatherhood had drifted from anything resembling its actual definition. Fatherhood, reduced in Kody Brown's framework to a financial and reputational transaction, was unrecognizable as the thing it was supposed to be. Rumors circulating among those who had followed the show for years suggested that Kody was also exploring the possibility of writing a tell-all book, a project framed as an opportunity to set the record straight and present his version of the Brown family's collapse. The reported intent of the book was to position Kody as the victim of a family that had abandoned him, a narrative that inverted the documented reality of what the cameras had captured across multiple seasons. Experts and long-term observers of the show argued unanimously that no book, regardless of how it was framed or how widely it was read, could undo the damage of a single silent stare from a child who had simply stopped believing in her father. The bike scene had become, in the words of those who analyzed it most closely, the Rosetta Stone of the Brown family's collapse, the one moment that made every preceding and subsequent event fully legible to anyone paying attention. The bike scene was not, at its core, about money. The cheap sweater and the discount book were not the source of the damage. The source of the damage was a fundamental and long-standing absence of empathy from a man who had consistently prioritized his own ego, his own image, and his own emotional comfort over the hearts of his children. The Christmas morning setup was simply the moment when that absence became impossible to explain away, rationalize, or edit around. It was the moment the mask came off in front of a camera that was still rolling, and the man behind it had nothing underneath worth seeing. The relationship between Kody Brown and his daughter Truly did not end with a confrontation. It did not end with a legal filing or a dramatic televised sit-down or a moment of mutual acknowledgement. It ended with the quiet closing of a door that he can never reopen. She broke Kody's ego by simply being herself and refusing to participate in his toxic game. games. The silent stare that dismantled him was not a calculated move from a child trained in psychological warfare. It was the entirely natural response of an 11-year-old girl who had been shown clearly and repeatedly exactly what her value was to her father, and who had finally, quietly believed what she had been shown. She didn't need to scream to be heard. She didn't need a mini bike to feel important. She simply needed to stop performing for a man who had never truly shown up for her, and in doing so, she exposed everything about him that years of careful television production had tried to conceal. Kody Brown was left exactly where his choices had been leading him for years, alone in a driveway, surrounded by expensive toys, with no one left who felt compelled to be impressed.